Yet. Welcome to everyone. My name is Kathleen Farrell. I direct work-life programs. I work in UW Human Resources. I'm thrilled about the number of you who are here today and the number of folks who have registered that can't join us for a session on children's social and emotional well-being during COVID. Such an incredibly important topic for our kiddos and for parents because your well-being is intertwined. So thanks for making this time to be together. I want to say thank you to the whole you who are partners in making today's event possible. At the end of today's session, I'll remind you of a few more webinars that are coming up in the coming weeks that many of you might find of interest too. So a couple quick notes of housekeeping before we dive into hearing from our amazing colleagues and experts. Today's session is being recorded. As I've said a few times, you'll notice that your camera is off and you've been muted. Depending upon how much time we have, we may invite you to unmute and ask some questions. We only have an hour and there's a lot of content and a lot of questions, so we may not be able to do that. But please use the chat at any time and we'll be looking at that throughout and responding to your questions. Several people submitted questions before today. The registration asked you if you wanted to put any questions out there. And our panelists and I looked at those and a lot of themes came up. And so we're pretty confident we're going to touch on a lot of the questions and challenges and ideas that brought you here. We know we won't get to all of them, but it's our commitment to try to make this the most worthwhile use of your time as we possibly can. So I am going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to very briefly introduce our wonderful panel of experts. The first is Dr. Liliana Lengua, who is the Maritz Family Foundation Professor of Psychology. She's also been directing the Center for Child and Family Wellbeing since it opened in 2011. And Liliana is a child clinical psychologist. And her research has focused on the contribution of children's temperament, their coping skills, and parenting on how they respond to adversity. So thank you so much for being with us, Lily. Our second panelist is Dr. Sarah Lytle, who is Director of Outreach and Education for the Institute for Learning and Brain Sciences. And I have to look because we all call it iLabs, but the Institute for Learning and Brain Sciences. And her team are the ones responsible for communicating just the latest science of child development to people who can put that research to use, including parents, policymakers, educators, and others. So thank you, Sarah, for being with us today. And last but not least is Dr. James Mazza, who is a professor of education and impromptu DJ. Thank you for giving us our walk-in music. Jim's research focuses broadly on adolescent mental health issues, particularly internalizing disorders such as depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress, exposure to violence, and suicidal behavior. He's also interested in the impact of exposure to violence in PTSD and the impact of social media and cyberbullying. So we are incredibly gifted at UW to have people doing such caring, important, and incredibly caring work. And we thank the three of you for being here today. We're now going to shift over to content. And so Sarah, Liliana, and Jim have all prepared just a few opening comments so you can know a little bit about them, their work. They'll share a little bit about what they're learning and seeing through their research, their work with families and educators. They'll each do that for 5-7 minutes, and then we'll turn it over to questions. So Sarah, are you willing to get us started?
Sure, happy to. Thank you so much, Kathleen, and thank you all for being here today. I think this is such an important topic. And I want to first acknowledge that this has been an incredibly stressful year. And I think that the discussions that we're having today are very, very important. But I also, as we have these discussions, want to just remind us all to be gentle with ourselves and to give ourselves some room to do what we need to do in these stressful times and recognize that we are doing the best that we can. And I think that is certainly a thing that we have been talking a lot about with parents as we interact with them at iLabs, the Institute for Learning and Brain Sciences. From my perspective, my training is as a child developmental psychologist, not from a clinical perspective, but from a research perspective. So thinking about how children learn, and particularly in those 0 to 5 years. So I'm really interested in thinking about infants, toddlers, and preschoolers, and especially with an emphasis on brain development, language development, screen media use in those early years, those social interactions that we know are so very important for kids. And so that's really where I'm coming to this panel from today. And in terms of, what I'm hearing and the kinds of things that we've been talking a lot about in the past, 6-8 months, I think first and foremost, we're getting a lot of questions about the impact of masks on children's development, particularly in these early years. Both sort of generally and then more specifically how it relates to their social interactions, their ability to have these social interactions, which we know are critical for their development, and then language development in particular. So just a couple of brief items, and we can certainly talk more about this, but there is some new research with 7-year-olds, so a little bit older than the 0 to 5 space. But there's some new research with 7-year-olds suggesting that these kiddos are able to recognize the emotions of other people who are wearing masks just as they are if those people are not wearing masks. And this is really supported by a lot of research in the adult literature and cross-cultural research. If you study children's ability to make those social emotional recognitions for in cultures where face coverings are much more common. As it turns out, our eyes are remarkably expressive, and we can learn a lot from other people's eyes. I think when you look at adults and when you see the adult studies on this, oftentimes researchers will simply show folks that little line that includes your eyes and ask people to identify the emotion that the person is feeling. And as humans, we are just remarkably good at that. So there's a lot of reason to think that kids are able to have social interactions, even in a masked environment, as they would otherwise. With regard to language more specifically, it is certainly true that, as little ones are learning language, they do look at lips, they look at mouth movements as one of many cues that helps them learn language. And so certainly, when children are perhaps learning language in an environment where folks are wearing masks, you don't have access to those kinds of cues from lips and mouths. And yet, we know that kids are getting a lot of other kinds of rich input. They're certainly getting that auditory input if they're learning an oral language. They are, seeing facial expressions broadly construed. So as we talked about, understanding the emotions that the person is feeling. And we also use a ton of gestures. I mean, you'll probably see my hands pop up frequently. I use gestures when I talk. We oftentimes use gestures when we talk. And as it turns out, gestures are a really great way for kids to learn language. And we can be a bit more intentional about all of these things as adults, recognizing that we can amplify those things in a masked environment. But it's certainly true that kids are able to learn language, and they will rely on other cues and also to make use of that time when they're at home in an unmasked environment, for example. And then I also want to just bring our attention back that particularly as I'm thinking about infants and toddlers, I mean, we know that all children are resilient, and young children are especially resilient. And so as much as mask wearing seems absolutely unusual to us as adults, kids are encountering new situations every day, and they're making adjustments as a result of that and in response to those new environments that they encounter. And to a certain extent, mask wearing is one of those. Yes, it requires some adjustments, but for a child who's making adjustments all the time, it's perhaps not as much of as an abnormal environment as it is for us as adults. So, and then the last thing I wanted to say is, I hope we get a chance to talk about how we maintain social connections, even in this time of social distancing, and perhaps when we're not seeing relatives and family and friends as much as we did before COVID and before the pandemic. And I think there are lots of really great resources out there to help families think of very creative ideas for promoting those social interactions, even in a time of social distancing. But that's, certainly something that we have studied and heard from parents that they're looking for those resources. So I hope that we'll get to that in the course of this webinar today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sarah. That's fantastic. And I'm guessing there will be a lot of questions that come from that. Jim, can we invite you to?
Sure. So thanks, Sarah. So I'm Jim Mazza, and I'm one of the faculty in the College of Education. And my specialty is actually in the area of school psychology. And so school psychologists work with kids' educational needs. And the interesting thing about educational needs is that we're finding that academic attainment, how well they do in school, is tied to how well they feel about themselves and how well their mental health is doing. And so there's an interrelationship that's there that we really haven't expressed a lot about, and that our research has, we're just starting to see the ways in which mental health and mental wellness actually can provide support to the academic attainment. And COVID has really kind of shown the spotlight on that, when we're now having a lot of kids who are struggling with some of the social isolation that Sarah just talked about, and trying to figure out how do we get them back into school because they're not doing their schoolwork. And so schools and school teachers are struggling quite a bit with trying to figure out how do we measure academic attainment, these grades, when students aren't participating as much as they have been in the past. And then what do we do with the kids who have some of these special needs or need a little bit more additional support? So I think that that's what I'm hearing from quite a few parents is, my kid feels very isolated. My student is not engaging in school like they used to. What do I do? And those are really real questions. I think that it's important to recognize that there's not one right or wrong answer here either, that every one of us parents is trying to figure this out because it's new to us. When I went to school, there was no class called Parenting Through a Pandemic. We didn't have one. And so we're all in this kind of together, and we're all trying to, get through this together as well, doing the best that we can. And I think one of the things that I want to talk about regarding the COVID and the misperception is, we started off going, okay, we got this. It'll be 6 to 8 weeks. I'll bake bread and we'll make cookies together, and we'll do all these things. And we're like, I can put my best foot forward for the 6 or 8 weeks. Well, we're coming up on a year. And so I'll bet you our best foot forward is no longer forward anymore. And so that we then start to personalize ourselves, like we're not being an efficient parent, we're not efficient at our jobs if we're working from home, and that all impacts our kids. And so we start to look at thinking like we're not effective in anything that we're doing right now, and that starts to spiral us down. So I want to make sure that you hear from me, even though I'm a school psychologist, I want to make sure that we support parents too, because they're really struggling with some of their mental health, some of the isolation that they have. And if they've got their partner at home all the time, that's new too. That's really hard. And so, and I have a wife who's a psychologist, right? And we're home together and we're like, ooh, there are times when it's really hard that way. And so I want to make sure that you hear from me and some of the ideas of how to support you when you're supporting your children, just not supporting your children. So I get it that we want to make sure that we support our kids. And as I tell my graduate students, you need to support yourself. Take care of yourself before you can take care of others. So that whole airline statement that we have, put your mask on first before you help others. Small ways of doing what parents are doing is I see them spending more time. I don't know about people on the call here. I can tell you that my life was extremely busy before COVID, and I didn't realize how busy it was. And so now that we're starting to kind of come out of this, I'm starting to think about ways that I don't want to go back to that rat race. I don't want to go back to being as busy as I was. How do I preserve the walks that I get to take with my kids? How do I preserve the bedtime reading that I do with some of my kids? And so those small ways that we have gotten to know our child more because we're spending more time with them, how do we preserve those? So looking at those, and you're going to have to proactively do some of those things, because we can get right back into that rat race, right back into what we were doing before. And I don't know if that's such a great idea from a family perspective. So that's it. I'll drop the mic and turn it over to Lily.
Thanks, Jim and Sarah. I will probably reiterate a couple of things that you guys both said. One, parents can give themselves a break, that what we're doing is enough and good enough. And what Jim's saying is parents can be taking care of themselves. My research has always focused on the effects of stress and adversity on kids, and really trying to understand which children are more likely to develop problems with their mental health or their social emotional well-being, and which ones are going to come out more resilient. And we know from years of research in various areas where kids are experiencing stress, like families who've been through divorce, or even families experiencing community level disasters like hurricanes. We know how important parents are to children's responses to those situations. Parents' emotional reactions, their mental health in those situations, is one of the strongest predictors of how children emerge from those stressful contexts. So I don't say that to put more pressure on parents. I say that to give you permission to take care of yourself. It's really important to attend to your stress and your emotional needs. And if that means stepping away from your child a little bit, that's okay. That's okay to give yourself that time. And that our kids will do well in stressful situations or do better when we're providing them with our warm, nurturing, loving, safe, stable contexts and relationships and some consistency in their lives. But that doesn't mean we have to dedicate every minute of our day to our kids. Some of the questions that parents raised were that their kids are demanding more and more of their time and need them, since they're home, need them to entertain them more and keep them busy. And that is a pressure on parents. Parents are really feeling that as a pressure right now. And there's really great research that shows that when parents can dedicate something like 15 to 20 minutes a day, maybe a half hour, but 15 to 20 minutes a day of really focused attention, playing with their children, letting your child lead that time and just following your child's lead, that short amount of time, when it's predictable and it happens every day or almost every day, really does address a number of key things. It helps children have a stronger, secure relationship with their parent. It helps kids really depend on that time so they can start making fewer bids for your attention at other times. And because they know it's coming and they don't have to keep asking for it. And more importantly, it lets parents feel less guilty about when they don't spend time with their kids. You know, this really special dedicated time is coming, and it's okay then to let yourself off the hook for all the rest of the time during the day. And the other thing that parents are really worried about these days is how much time their kids are on devices. And so that's why they're feeling a lot of pressure for keeping their kids busy and entertaining them, making sure they're doing healthy things besides being on a device. And I'll just add that that's really important, but that also can be time limited. So as long as we know we are spending those 20 minutes of dedicated time with our kids, or, even if you have a half hour a day, that's great. If your kids are spending 10 to 20 minutes outside, 10 to 20 minutes reading a book or doing something creative and doing some exercise, so maybe a total of an hour and a half of their day is taken up with other healthful activities, I would say let go of the pressure to keep them off the screen. Know that they've done something healthy, several healthy things through the day, and let ourselves off the hook. That right now we're all so overwhelmed and busy that some extra screen time isn't as bad as it seems, as long as they're doing these other things. So that's what I wanted to share based on the questions that I'd read in the content, and I'm happy to take other questions.
Thank you all so much for that background, which I think really, I hope, opens up a lot of wonderful questions. And again, to everybody who's joined us, please use the chat to share some thoughts that are on your mind. I'm going to ask you, Lily and Sarah and James, a couple of questions that did come in from folks at the time they registered. And the first one is a little bit unfair because it covers a big space, and I'm doing that on purpose to kind of invite you to share pretty broadly from your expertise. But a lot of parents asked questions that were expressing concern just about what they're seeing in their kids' behavior. And the examples they gave were for all age groups, from the smallest kids, toddlers, up through high schoolers. And they really ranged a lot of different behaviors. Some were kids who are they seem to be regressing. Maybe they were becoming more independent and now they're super needy. Or maybe just what seems like a shift from a child who was very outgoing, who's now downright fearful of strangers. Again, with regression, maybe they're throwing tantrums. They had been developing some self-regulation, some emotional regulation, and now they're acting out. And so I think the questions that kept coming up were, gosh, when should I be concerned? Like, when should I be concerned? And is there action I should be taking? And then what do I do with the rest as a parent when I start to observe these changes? So, Lily, you are unmuted right now. So I'm going to ask you if you want to get us started.
Dude, I should have muted myself. No, it's a tough question and it's great. I think that recognizing that everyone is having a lot of emotions right now, and there are a lot of ups and downs, that's really normal. As Jim said already, that this has gone on much longer than we anticipated, and our tolerance and our ability, our resources for being strong and keeping positive may be getting taxed. So some up and down is, I think, expected and normal. And, our children's behaviors are going to also be like that in their own age appropriate or developmental way. I think so parents can and parents are feeling really worried. And I think, just knowing that everyone's kind of going through that and having that experience and normalizing the fact that kids are having these emotional experience situations is normal. I think we can be concerned if we think that it's really interfering with very normal activities. So if that anxiety or if those emotions are really posing a barrier to doing any schoolwork at all, or just normal interactions. So the more we see disruptions to kind of other functioning, then we can be potentially concerned and may want to consult with a therapist or a psychologist.
All right, I'll jump in. Lily's right that what we're concerned about is having the impact on their main priority, the main vocational. As adults, we'd say if it's getting in the way of our work, then we'd say it's a problem. If it's getting in the way of their academics, then we think, okay, it's time to do something. I do think that we are in this place of having sometimes this roller coaster with our kids. Keep in mind, it's new to them. They would like to have the structure of schools. And I think it's one of the reasons why we as a society are trying to get our kids back to school. It's easier on them. It's easier on us as the parents, because then we're not just nitpicking and micromanaging them. And I've got 2 adolescents and I've got a 3rd grader. And sometimes I don't think they like their dad, because I'm just kind of, you couldn't do this at school. Like, I know. And so, there are things that I have to let go. So when they flip over to, Terraria or to, some other Fortnite, for the 5 minutes during lunch, I mean, normally they couldn't do that at school. I get it. Is that the fight I want to have with them? And I'm like, no. Does that mean I have not had that fight with them? No, I've had it. It's not effective. It doesn't, I'd rather try to support them as much as I can. And so I would work on, once the emotional issue has happened, and if there's been an outburst or a temper tantrum, when it's happening at that time, it's really hard to teach skills and strategies. So when that temper tantrum is done, then I think it's having a way to say, hey, I'm not the perfect dad. I'm not the perfect parent. So sorry that you were upset with me. And I'm wondering if there's another way in which you could tell me that you're getting upset. Is what way can we work together as a team? Because it's a lose-lose situation. When I'm yelling at you and you're yelling back at me, lose-lose. So how do we help describe to each other that I'm starting to get frustrated and you're starting to get frustrated, so that we can be on the same page, so that we don't get to the temper tantrum level? I think that would be important. And that works for our 5 to 6 year olds, and it works for our adolescents as well.
I think those are both fantastic answers. And the only thing I would add is that, especially as we're thinking about very young children, behavior changes come with the territory, right? That is part of development, and a lot of behavior changes are developmentally appropriate. But I think if you go back to what both Lily and Jim were saying in terms of, is it persistent over time? Is it something that feels, like a regression that's not actually getting better? And so if you have those repeated concerns, or is it, if it's interfering with daily functioning, that's the point at which you talk to your pediatrician, particularly for the young guys, just to make sure that what you're seeing is, to sort of tease apart whether that's developmentally appropriate or whether that's something that you really need to seek some intervention for.
Great. Thank you all. There's a couple of questions that have come up, kind of digging a little deeper into what you've shared so far. One of them, Sarah, I know you mentioned this during your introduction, which was around everybody wants to have some more social interaction. And so I think there's a question, how to do that, how to make that happen. And then I think, I know I'm hearing from a lot of friends and family members whose kids are afraid of going back to in-person interactions. So there's, how do we do that now? How do we make social interactions the best and most supportive, but then anticipating some of that anxiety of, gosh, having real face-to-face interactions, which can be scary for some kids.
Sure. I think that the good news here is that this was probably most difficult in those, the really terrible winter months when outside interactions were less feasible and less possible. I think certainly now that, well, hopefully, knock on wood, that the sun is out to stay, perhaps, I think that becomes a much more realistic possibility in terms of children's ability to be outside and be socially distanced while wearing masks around their peers. That said, I think that there are a number of ways. We have heard lots of stories from parents who have, instituted the Zoom bedtime story with grandparents who are across the country. And, perhaps that wasn't happening before the pandemic, but this now has become a very intentional effort to get that some social interaction, even via Zoom, with friends and family members who are, either can't visit or not close by. And I think that's great. There's a lot of research suggesting that Zoom has that back and forth interaction in the same way that a live social interaction does. And so you still have to demonstrate a lot of those abilities to interact with a human, even though it's via screen. So I would suggest certainly that is a great way to encourage interactions. We've also heard from some parents who are encouraging socially distanced sidewalk chalk games outside with their community and their neighborhood. If you have the ability to do something like that, maybe it's tic-tac-toe that you're going to play on, this part of the sidewalk, and some of the kids are going to come through the neighborhood, and you don't have to be there at the same time, but you can do that, or you're going to make your hopscotch chart on the sidewalk and do that. So there are some really great opportunities. I know in my neighborhood, lots of folks have put up signs and stuffed animals in their windows, so that people going through and taking a walk can do a little bit of a scavenger hunt to find all the animals in windows. We've also heard about things like, acting out a story and recording yourself and sending it to a friend. And then maybe they add on to the story, or they act out their own story and send it back to you. So I think there are lots of ways to be creative about, maintaining those relationships, which is really the core of those social interactions, or thinking about relationships. In terms of fear about going back to in-person relationships, I think that you almost need to scaffold that experience and really support the child through that experience, in a new way, and maybe we review, particularly for the younger kids, what's going to happen when we go back to this, live in-person interaction. Well, they might want to shake your hand. Are we okay with that? And that certainly will depend on a number of factors in the world at the time, but go through it and really kind of role play. And, we think of social stories as sort of setting up that context for kids. What do you expect? How are you going to behave? How is the other person likely to behave? And really kind of walk them through that so they have those expectations in mind. We know that can be enormously helpful.
I'll jump right in and let you know that the Grandma and Grandpa Mazza have been doing the Zoom times for bedtime, and they use Sudoku and word search puzzles. And so they send them to us ahead of time. We print them out. They spend the day or 2 days figuring them out. And then Grandma meets with them to go through them. And we really like having the Zoom calls or the FaceTime calls, whatever, because it really is part of that interaction that they don't get. We also, when we've been taking our dog for a walk, so we're one of the families that has a pandemic puppy, all right? And so the biggest reason there is because we said we would never have one because we traveled too much, and when COVID hit, all the traveling was done. So we have a pandemic puppy, and we walk our puppy. When we go by houses of people that our kids know and that we know the parents, we call them and text them, hey, are you around? Can you come out? And so they stay in their yard, we're on the sidewalk. It's nice to just have some of that collaboration and discussion, and the parents get as much out of that as the kids do. And so I think having some situations that way. Regarding the in-person, I like what Sarah said. So right now, some of the schools are providing that scaffolding by inviting the elementary or middle schoolers back to the school for like 1 hour. They get to see their class, socialize, no academics at all, just back to the flow of going to school, remember what it looks like, their classrooms, and then kind of providing some of the expectations so that it's not such a big lift when we come hopefully to in the fall, or maybe it's next month when we start to go back in person. So I think scaffolding some of those interactions will be important. And then my last point is we've had to change our mindset as parents that some of our adolescents communicate through a headset playing Fortnite or playing some of these games because that's when they talk to their friends, because their friends are online. So we have had to use kind of a rule to say, yes, you can play a video game if you've got a friend that's online also playing a video game. And again, that opens the doors for other concerns that we have when there's people that they don't know possibly playing. And we've had to put in the parent safety rules that way. And it's been a really good way for our kids, though, to stay in contact with some of their friends, because that's what they would talk about if they're in person anyway. So we're trying to not necessarily promote more screen time. We're just not saying no to it at this point because it's actually a mechanism for them to talk to each other.
Great. Thank you both for like very concrete examples. And I know that we have 108 participants today, and many of you probably have some great examples of what you've been doing with your family too. So please share your wisdom in the chat with one another. So there's some more ideas about socialization and how you found safe ways for your children to be with their peers or family members as well. Liliana, there's a couple of questions in the chat or comments as well. Some very much acknowledging that advice that I know I've heard you give before about that 15 to 20 minutes of time really is magical and really wonderful. So thank you again from parents who have heard that and taken that advice to heart. But someone observes that eventually that 15 to 20 minutes ends, and you still need to separate and go back to your work or what you were doing. And so any advice about kind of supporting or minimizing the tantrums or challenge that a child might feel when they lose that like focused time with their parent?
Yeah, I saw those questions too. That's great. It's never, so every child is different. And so there's definitely going to need to be some different structure put around those for different kids. For some kids, it's easier. And then other children, that separating might be hard. One of the things that a parent can do is to try to be incredibly consistent about the time of day and the length of time. And while there will be more tantrums at first, they may decrease over time. I'm not saying that's going to work for everyone, but that's one thing we do recommend. Another thing we recommend is setting a timer. And so everyone can see it, the child and the parent. It doesn't come out as a surprise to the child. And then the other thing is being really clear and firm, not in an angry or difficult way, but as the parent saying, okay, that's our time. And we are always going to end at this time, and just be as consistent as possible with that. And again, kids will tantrum more for a little while, and then it'll hopefully dissipate. Again, not for everybody, but for most kids it will. The more a parent hems and haws, the more a parent says, oh, I'm sorry. Okay, 1 more minute. Okay, 5 more minutes. All right, you say, whatever. The more, kind of feeling bad about ending the time, the more likely it is to keep being harder to end. And again, that's different for different kids. So keep in mind that some kids are going to be really reward oriented. Their temperament. We can talk a whole hour on temperament alone. And some kids are just more reward oriented. And if they're finding that time rewarding, they don't want to leave it alone. Other kids are, just fine they're satisfied with what they got out of that. And so for those kids who are really reward oriented, they also get really more angry and frustrated than normal, or than you would expect when they can't have what they're really enjoying and hoping for. So just know that that's also a temperament difference, and just may require even more structuring and consistency around parents. And I'm not pretending that's going to solve the problem for everyone, but those kinds of things typically help a lot. I also noticed a couple questions about whether reading time at bedtime counts. And what we really encourage is as we think about this child-led time or child-dedicated time, letting the child choose what they want, letting them pick, and really following their lead and honoring what they enjoy and choose. And I'll tell you, there were years and years that I played My Little Pony and wasn't really having a whole lot of fun with that activity. But watching my child have fun and letting her pick and watching her agency and her creativity in that situation was really the treasure of those times. The reading time at bedtime may be something different for families. I mean, your child may choose to read during that time. They may say, will you read to me? Or can we read together? That's great. But reading at bedtime is also a nice transition. It's another way to structure bedtime so there's less arguments and conflict at bedtime. So in your family, if that's the purpose that's serving, try not to let that also serve the purpose of your child focus time. I was trying to read the chats. I might have missed other comments in there, but.
No, that's great. There's I'm trying to jot down the chat. So if some of you haven't heard your question asked yet, you can hold us honest, but I'm pretty sure we'll get to them all. There were a couple of questions that came up. One of them, I'm not sure whether it's something you all can provide feedback on. It's more around, I think, physical safety. And one person asked about how do you think about kids going back, in this case, to sports given where we currently are with COVID and what the current phase 2 regulations are. Is there any thoughts on that?
I'll jump in. We've got 2 of our 3 that are playing soccer now again, and that was something that they did routinely. They've been doing for the last like 4 years, and so one is almost 13 and one is 8, and so we were a little apprehensive at first as parents. We made sure that the kids had masks on. What's interesting is that the 8-year-old is very compliant, always has the mask on. The almost 13-year-old sees their buddies and like almost nobody has the mask on. They have it, down around here, which kind of defeats the purpose. And yet you can see that they're trying to fit in with everybody else. The coach is okay with that. And so we didn't want to raise a fuss about that. And so they do keep pretty distant. We're just getting into phase 2 to where now they're going to start playing games. That should be interesting, see what happens there. And so sports becomes a way for our kids to socially interact, though. And it's something that they need, not only the interaction, but they also need some of the physical activity. And so it's more of kind of like, I think what Lily was talking about, that we might have to get used to it at first. It's going to be a little bit hard at first. And we want to see that they've set out strategies for them to provide some social distance interactions. And, I know that my daughter, who's now 8, is going to start softball in next month. And so that again is going to be, so how are we going to do this? You can't clean the ball every time somebody hits it or, catches it, whatever else. And so what is that going to look like? And so, I think that and this is my opinion, that the benefits of my daughter playing softball and my son playing soccer, I think are going to outweigh some of the risks that are there. Now, I can say that without having a multi-generational home. I can say that without having some of the vulnerabilities maybe that other people may have that are medical that are there. And so I think it's like we said at the beginning, it's not a one size fits all approach. And so I think everybody has to kind of weigh that out. I think getting social interactions and sports back into the repertoire of some of our kids can be a healthy thing.
Thanks so much, Jim. Another parent asked about any advice for children who are neurodiverse. And I will take this opportunity as well to say that next week, we actually have another webinar coming up that's going to feature Robin Talley from the UW Autism Center and Kathleen Meeker from the Herring Center that will go a little bit deeper. But I know the 3 of you also have expertise and experience supporting families and kiddos, and wonder if you can share some thoughts.
I think, my first thought is that neurodiverse is an enormous category and every child has unique needs. And so the more we can meet those needs and address the needs for specific kids, the better. And I know that's not a very specific answer at all, but neurodiverse is such a broad category that I think, some kids are going to need, a lot of scaffolding to go back to social interactions. Some kids are, going to need, a lot of frameworks or schedules and structure. And I mean, it really is going to vary. So I know that's not a perhaps terribly specific answer, but I think that's my first thought.
I'll chime in and put right on top of that beautiful foundation that Sarah just provided us, is that I would, as a parent, I would want to overestimate how much transition time that they need instead of under, because they're going to feel left alone then. And we don't want that isolation, that detachment type of thing happening. And so I would want to walk my child into whatever that transition is, see that they sit down, maybe model it for them if you're still doing the virtual learning at home, those types of things, to make sure that they feel safe and they have what they need. Because, it's really hard for our kids who don't advocate for themselves because they don't want to ask a question to a teacher that they don't have the right book, aren't on the right page number, those types of things. And so helping to walk them through that step. And then once they get to the transition, remaining there maybe for a minute or two to make sure that they have started back up and that they are on the next step or the next level of getting their strategy, their instruction, whatever that project is that they're going to be doing.
Great. Thanks, Jim. There were a variety of questions that came in at the registration time that were around anxiety, acknowledging there's just high anxiety for children, high anxiety for parents. Some of the anxiety is very specifically seems to be rooted in COVID, whether that's fear of getting sick or death. There's also just generalized anxiety about normal things, like a child receiving feedback from a teacher that starts to kind of spiral cognitively and becomes debilitating. And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how parents can identify and respond to anxiety in their children. And again, like what are some benchmarks for when might they need to get some support from outside of their family to help their child as well?
Yeah, I can jump in there. So anxiety, first off, for our parents who have children that might be experiencing anxiety, and for our parents that might be experiencing anxiety, it's real, right? So I want to make sure that we validate that that person, that child may be experiencing some of that anxiety. So it doesn't come out of the middle of nowhere at this point. The other thing that I would say is that when you know that your child is experiencing anxiety, say around a subject, math or reading or introducing themselves to new people, is that we ask them to think about what that would be like when they're going to for the next opportunity. So often our kids' anxiety goes up because they're anticipating the worst scenario that's going to happen to them, and so they take it to the furthest corner, the extreme. Nobody's going to like me. Nobody's going to talk to me. I'm going to fail math, and so we have a skill that we talk about check the facts. Is that really going to be the case? And we kind of walk our kids through the fact that I don't think it's nobody. And if that happens, what skills do you have to do this? And what strategy you have? So you actually prepare them for actually the worst case scenario, which may not even happen. And so I think that if you can diffuse some of the extreme thinking that they do at the very beginning, it helps kind of make that anxiety, the severity of the anxiety come down a bit. And then, watching them provide or get involved and engage in some of these activities and complimenting them on that, you appreciated that they talked to somebody, they went up and asked a question, those types of things, and to check in with them. And they come back and say, so nobody died, you did a nice job with this, and just kind of highlighting to them that it wasn't the worst thing in the world, because we as adults, even we as kids, start to create the worst case scenario. And so we want to make sure that our kids see the facts that it wasn't actually the worst case scenario. Things did okay. It doesn't mean that you didn't like it though. Maybe there was a little bit of uncomfortability. Yeah, that's how things go. And we can still focus, we can still provide our attention, even when we're not feeling the most comfortable possible.
Yeah, I'd love to add a little to that. I agree completely with what Jim's saying. And, you know, anxiety is one of those things. It's a biologically programmed response in parents when we see our kids fearful and the look in their face when they're afraid and anxious, to protect them. We're just programmed to be protective in those contexts. And being protective with exposure to some real threat is important. And knowing that the threat isn't so real is also important. To know when to gently push our children, to gently encourage them to do the thing or expose themselves to the thing they're afraid of, because it's that exposure and that experience that'll slowly chip away with their anxiety. And in COVID, we're faced with this very challenging reality that the threat is real to some degree or other. And knowing when to push our kids into a social situation, when to encourage them to play Little League or whatever, when there's also a real threat. And parents may themselves be wondering, should I get exposed? What if I get exposed through my child doing it? So there's all this anxiety floating around, and the children can feel that and read that in us, just as we read it in them. So I just want to acknowledge the challenge that that COVID presents in helping our kids deal with anxiety. For us to weigh our own readiness and our own anxiety in a situation to engage, and then how much we want to encourage that engagement or approach in our children. So it takes some self-awareness to know when to push and not to push. There's another question I think that relates to, and one of the parents asked about letting their kids play sports, and Jim really nicely addressed that. And other parents are asking about how to get on the same page about when to start school or go back to school, all of these things. And I'll just add, that's all in this arena of uncertainty, where we all have our own individual differences in how comfortable we are with the threat or the risk of this. And again, it's a unique situation in COVID that we're faced with this somewhat real threat out there, as opposed to, what are often just not health risks or, real physical risks of doing things. So I think, just really sharing where we're at and talking through what the pluses and minuses. We faced this with my 21-year-old when she wanted to move out of our house into an apartment this year. We faced this with my 18-year-old when he wanted to go away to campus instead of staying home this year. He started college, and just really weighing his threat sensitivity, our threat sensitivity, and talking really openly and, just really specifically about how to stay safe in those different situations and how we can protect ourselves in those situations. So I think having conversations with kids about that is really important.
I'll jump into that. Our 12-year-old, our almost 13, and our 14-year-old, we've asked them if they feel comfortable too. And so as a parent, so I try to weigh the pros and cons and the risks and the benefits, right? And I know that even when, I as a parent are going to give my child a car in a couple of years, I'm going to have anxiety about that, right? That's going to be an anxious time. I'm going to call Lily and say, how did you do this, right? And so I also though wanted to get my children's input so that we could make a decision together. I wanted to empower them to say, I'm taking your advice into consideration. And so my middle child's like, Dad, I really want to go play soccer. I need to get back out there. I want to run around. I really love this game. And so that helped me feel a little bit better. Does that mean the risk of me getting COVID from him has gone down? No, it does mean though that he's telling me where his perception is. And I think that's important for us to take into consideration rather than just our own anxiety about that situation. And again, I'm going to go back to what I said at the very beginning. There's not a one size fits all approach. And so you have to measure this out for what is happening in your family, your situation, and so forth.
Great. There's a question a little bit ago in the chat that was a little bit different than some of the perspective we've taken so far. And it was looking at kids that are a little bit older who may be unsupervised a lot more right now. I think the question was actually about high schoolers. I know there are some families where it's true for older middle schoolers as well. And so this question about how to support or what to be looking out for when children are now having, because maybe both parents need to report to work, how to be supporting them and what to be looking for.
All right, I'll jump in. I feel like I'm talking a lot here, so I'm going to be short. So I do a lot of work with adolescents. And so as Kathleen reported, I work with those internalizing difficulties that for adolescents and middle schoolers. And so depression, anxiety, self-harm and suicidal behavior, PTSD. And so I keep trying, when I work with my own kids and to work with adolescents, I want them to see that I value their opinion. And so for me, it's about structure. What are you going to do here and here and here? What are the places that we're not supposed to be visiting, especially online? And then what kinds of blocks can I put in to say, this is out of bounds, all right? Do I know that they may decide to go onto some websites that I would not approve of? Yep, that's going to happen. Do I know that as a kid, me as an adolescent, did I follow every single rule that my parents gave me? Nope. And so that's part of that developmental perspective that I think Sarah talks about, is that's part about being a kid, right? What I don't want to do is judge their behavior when I come back, or I catch that, I look at their history and say, oh my gosh, why are you doing this? I'd say, let's talk about this. What were you thinking when this happened here? Or tell me what was attractive to this, so that we have a constructive conversation rather than a top-down conversation where it's just me lecturing my child, because they're not going to share with me then as many times the frustrations that they have as an adolescent, even when they go back to in-person. So I want to try to keep that communication open and as non-judgmental as I can, while also telling my child, my job is to protect you. I love you a lot. And so if I sound upset or difficult or mad, it's because I want you to have a really good life and I want you to be safe. And so that's my worry. And so that's, I kind of go from that angle.
Excellent. So as I listen to what the three of you have shared and some of the very specific advice you've given, some of the takeaways from research that you're doing or you're very familiar with, there's this theme of the, the role that parents are playing in the pandemic and how much work it takes, right? Like we're acknowledging we're a year into this. Parents are having anxiety, kids are having anxiety. So can we shift to talking about parent well-being and caregiver well-being? And maybe invite all of you to share either from your own lived experience as parents or your research. What are some things that you would encourage everyone who's participating today to keep in mind? Maybe things you've already said, but it's worth hearing again and again, or maybe some new tips or advice.
I'll jump in first. The things that I said earlier about our kids, we feel better when they're online so much when we know they've done 20 minutes of each of 5 for 4 healthful activities. I would say the exact same thing for us. I mean, some of us are online all day working and are getting our kids set up with school, and then we're feeling bad that we didn't spend time with them, and then we're getting dinner ready or whatever that is, that it's so easy to put ourselves off. But I think 10 or 15 minutes a day of something that helps us reduce our stress, whether that is a bath or reading or listening to music or mindfulness or a meditation practice, 10 to 20 minutes, ideally 20 to 30 minutes of some kind of physical activity or exercise, 10 to 20 minutes of something creative. And, just making sure that we've done that variety of things, 10 to 20 minutes outside. I hate going outside when it's cold, but I do make myself stand outside for a little bit and just get some fresh air. And if we've done those things, if we're making sure our kids are doing that, we should be making sure we're doing that too, and just maintaining our own healthful behaviors. And if we are struggling emotionally, then consider thinking, what do I need? Do I need more social support? Do I need to speak to a therapist or a counselor? And just not feeling like we're letting down our kids by focusing on ourselves a little bit more, because that is actually doing both. It's helping ourselves and helping our children.
Yes, I agree with everything that Lily said. And I think the other thing that I would add is, one of the things that that I have been feeling certainly is that, with, as Jim mentioned, travel gets shut down, events get shut down, and it feels like every day is the same. And so I think one of the things that's been very valuable for me that I've been recommending is plan things to get excited for. And it doesn't have to be anything monumental. It can be that, but make it in advance so you have time to get excited about it. You have time to anticipate it, and it becomes that sort of milestone marker in time and in a timeline that, otherwise might feel very mundane and very similar day to day. And it does not matter to me if that means, you're going to go get ice cream one day, or if you're going to, plan a backyard Olympics, and that can be, something that's exciting for you as a parent and, and for the family. And you're going to, it's going to be a day-long thing, and it's going to be fun, and you're going to get messy, and everybody's okay with that. It doesn't matter to me what the thing is, but I think it's really important for us to have things to look forward to celebrate, to anticipate. And I think that does a lot of good for mental health, and it, and make it something that you don't have to, doesn't require a lot of planning, right? I mean, we're not trying to add things here. We're trying to give you something to look forward to. So I think that's been a very helpful tip, both for me and I think some of the parents that I've talked to.
I would totally agree with Sarah and what Lily said too. We were pretty structured creatures, before this COVID thing happened. And then all of a sudden we lost all of our structure. And so we don't know what we're supposed to be anticipating. And so I think sometimes having that structure so that you can see some things, whether they're staycations or vacations, put them out there so that you can actually look forward to it, start planning for them. We really like having things that we can plan to do. We talk about what we call the please skills for helping kids with emotional vulnerability, and they help with adults. So that please is actually an acronym. So reduce physical illness, that's the P. Limited screen time, so you have designated screen time and then off of screen time. All right, and so that has to be the parents too. It's not okay for you to kick your kids off their computer while you're on your cell phone. All right, and then we have the E for eating a balanced diet. And all of us know that we're supposed to eat a balanced diet. As a matter of fact, we learned this in 2nd and 3rd grade. And how many of us actually have a balanced diet? All right, avoid overindulgence in drugs or alcohol. Right, not to say you can't have your glass of wine, can't have your beer. All right, And so certainly the Mazza household, we use some of having a beer, a glass of wine as part of our survival skills at the beginning, right? Just not overdoing it, all right? The S in please is for sleep. How many of us get 8 hours of sleep or 7 hours of sleep? How many of us are when we're groggy and don't get enough sleep that we're ornery? Yeah, I am, no question. My kids know when I don't get enough sleep. And the last E is for exercise, that 20 to 30 minutes that Lily talked about. Go out and get some exercise. So these please skills are to help you be you, right? Helping you take care of yourself before you can take care of others. And they also reduce the emotional vulnerability of your kiddos as well.
I love that acronym. Thank you. I had not heard that. We are at 1:27. The hour has gone so quickly. Thank you, Jim and Liliana and Sarah, for your incredible contributions. Participants, we'll save the chat, and there are some things that we'll either pick up in future webinars or in some articles that we'll distribute through the Whole U as well and through our parent listserv. As I mentioned earlier, there's a couple of events coming up next week. There is a session on caring for children with complex needs during COVID. And we also know many of us are in a sandwich generation and are caring for adult relatives as well. And on March 9th, there's a session on caring for yourself if you're caring for a loved one who's living with dementia. So a lot more opportunities to come together in community and conversation and to benefit from the incredibly caring, beautiful group of experts that we have in the UW community. So thank you all. Please be watching your email for an evaluation and continue taking great care of you. If you leave with one thing today, it is investing in yourself, is investing in your children. And so please keep making opportunities like this one. Breathe deep and remind yourself that you are doing what no one in history has ever done before. So we're learning and growing. Be kind.
Thanks for having us. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone,
you.
for asking your questions. Thanks, Kathleen.
Jim, I think I might do a little blog post using the please metaphor and then tap into some of the rest of what you all shared to kind of flesh out some of those healthy things. I think those are just such easy, accessible, and important.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's great. And so Lily has them. She just doesn't have an acronym to go with them. She mentioned almost every one of them. So, yep.
It's great. Great. Okay.
And we need them as the parents, right? So, yep.
Perfect. Well, again, Jim and Liliana and Sarah, I don't know, I would love to follow up with you again offline to say thank you and hear your feedback. I'm always happy to organize more events to push out information. And so if there's things that you don't feel like we addressed fully today or that you saw in the chat that I missed, please pass it along. We're learning, like everybody else during the pandemic, how to be more supportive. And so your insight is invaluable.
Thanks, Kathleen. You did such a great job monitoring the chat and summarizing the questions and directing them. Thanks for putting this together.
Right. And this was great. And so if there are other needs that are coming up now that we might be going to phase 2.5, whatever it is, I mean, I'm happy to do this again. I think we have a lot of parents that are struggling that maybe have joined us. And so we'd like to help them out so that they struggle less with their kids in the transition.
Okay. Well, you've now volunteered yourself. I will definitely be careful what you offer because I will take it.
Coming after you.
All right. Well, I'm going to end. And again, thank you all. Go enjoy the sunshine. Get your few minutes of vitamin D.